Tom, thank you for accepting my invitation.
Of course, David.
I'm making a video piece about the Venezuela and US tensions.
Okay.
The focus now is on the crude oil. And I
Okay.
know I learned that you have a lot of experience in that field. Can you explain first what's the potential behind Venezuela's crude oil reserves? Where are they situated? And why are they so talked?
Well, this issue of Venezuela's crude oil reserves, this has been known for a long time, before Chavez came to power in late 2019, 2020. Venezuela has the largest crude reserves in the world. Now, the quality of the crude reserves are not as high, for example, as Saudi Arabia or those in the United States. However, with modern technology, with pre-processing, it's very heavy crude oil. Venezuela's crude oil is the main bulk of it is what's called extra heavy crude, and it's in the Orinoco Basin along the Orinoco River. And this was begun to be exploited just shortly before Chavez came to power. 3 or 4 big foreign firms came. Each one tried a different method for refining the oil. And later they found, shortly after Chavez was in power, that in fact all the methods are viable. So they could produce crude at a reasonable price from very heavy crude. And what they produce actually is something that they call synthetic oil. It's made from the natural extra heavy oil, but it's made lighter, sufficiently light, so that it can be exported and refined in normal refineries. So it's a little more expensive because of this process, but the actual process of getting it out of the ground is quite cheap, and exploration and so forth is very easy. It's not much of an issue. So these are the biggest reserves in the world, and they have great capacity in the future.
Yes, but right now, why does Venezuela export so little?
Ah, okay. Why does Venezuela export so little oil? It's a combination of factors, but I'd say most centrally was actually the incompetence of the present Chavista regime, both under Hugo Chavez and under Nicolas Maduro now. In the earlier period, when Chavez came to power, much of what brought him to power, he was a populist. He made the claim that the old government was collaborating with foreign companies and stealing the oil riches of Venezuela. It was in a period when the price of oil was going down and it was hard to make money, and they started to invest a lot of money and for the first time take very large amount of foreign investment to develop their oil. They had a certain strategy to adopt to this new market where they thought there'd be low prices internationally for a long time. However, that meant there was a lot less money for the state. And so Chavez and others used this in a populist way to say, these people are stealing from the state. I mean, people were always stealing from the state in Venezuela, but this was fundamentally stealing, and he used this as part of the excuse for his electoral campaign to come to power. Now, once he was in power, he was willing to make deals with many different countries. The problem is, when he made these deals, he made a very big deal with China, which from a market point of view was very rational. That was at the point China was expanding rapidly and really needed the oil, and it could be an alternative market besides the traditional one in the United States for Venezuelan oil. The problem is he didn't carry through on any of the agreements. This is both a matter of extreme corruption in the value chain, in the production chain onshore, as part of a way to support his government. That the corruption made new elites that were sympathetic to his government and supported by it, the military as well. But it was also, anyway, so largely due to corruption, but also incompetence. The oil company went on strike against Chavez in 2002, objecting to his policies that they would not work well for Venezuela, and it was a ruinous strike. What happened is, well, of course, oil production plummeted in 2002, 2003 during the strike, but there was sabotage against the oil fields, and many fields were damaged. And what Chavez did is fired basically everyone with a doctorate, everyone with a master's degree in what was one of the largest, or second or third largest, oil company in the world. And so the company was left without competence and without trust of foreign oil companies working with them. And so they were never able to recover the production of oil. And Chavez was able to survive because exactly at this time, as due to incompetence and corruption, the production of Venezuelans oil continued to fall. The price continued to rise very high up until 2008. And in the end, he actually was making more money. And so the incompetence was covered up, okay? And when the price finally started coming down later, and especially when Nicolas Maduro came, this was ruinous, disastrous for the country. There had not been investment, even under Chavez. The money that the foreign oil companies would invest into the joint production fields was oftentimes diverted into electoral campaigns and into various kinds of populist enticements to people in constant elections. So the incompetence was covered up for many years with high prices. So here we are, very low production in the country.
And when we have so much little export, currently there's the tension with the United States. Sorry for my English, but I hear my voice when I talk to you, and that's messing my mind.
Yeah, but if one of my answers is way too long for you, you can ask me to say something again shortly, and you could edit it. You know.
Yes, good.
So I'm sorry. What is your question again?
My question is currently on the Trump threats. Does he really does it to fight against drug trafficking, or he wants to reach an economic deal, or to secure these natural resources? Is there something else behind this drug trafficking narrative?
Well, of course, there's this drug trafficking narrative that President Trump has used to say that fentanyl is being smuggled in these speedboats from Venezuela to the United States. Now, this is not my area of expertise, so what I do is I go and I listen to some experts. And from what I can tell, academic experts, people who are informed, say, of course the United States has a fentanyl problem, but it's not coming from Venezuela. Very little of that comes from Venezuela. It comes from China, from Mexico, and internally. What these drug boats appear to be, according to other experts, is it's probably cocaine that in the end is to be smuggled to Europe, maybe through the United States or through Caribbean islands, and to go to Europe. So there are drugs involved. We know that Trump personally has, drugs are a very big deal to him, the idea of opposing drugs and drug addiction. So it's a personal issue to him also. So whether he believes this or not, that this is the cause of the fentanyl crisis in the United States is one thing, but it isn't, okay? So it's also a casus belli. It's also a casus belli in the sense that the United States is presenting this as a reason to take violent action to perhaps change the regime in Venezuela. And so there are two other reasons Trump would go against Venezuela. Venezuela has 7.9 million refugees just in the period of the consolidation of the Maduro government. That's according to the UNCHR, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. 7.9 million refugees. It's more than Ukraine without a war. This talks to the incompetence of the regime and the corruption as far as feeding its own people. You know, Marx said the first responsibility of a socialist government is to feed the people. Well, if this is a socialist government, it's totally failed on that account. There's near starvation and huge inflation and corruption. So one thing is the United States is raising the issue of drugs. Another thing is the immigration to the United States, which is a major issue for Trump. He wants to stop uncontrolled immigration, but that's also a big deal for all the countries surrounding Venezuela, even more. That's a lot of people to absorb. The third thing is there is the oil. Now, Chavez and other left populists who took over in Venezuela always said the imperialists want our oil. They're going to come, they're going to invade, and he constantly talked on his Sunday-long talk shows on national television about the imperialistas. They're going to come and take our oil because they need our oil. Now, you know, there may have been times in history where that would happen. But for all these years that Chavez has been there, these, especially later, these were the years starting around 2005, actually 2007 especially, is when fracking began in the United States. Oil was starting to become abundant in the United States, and the United States didn't need the Venezuelan oil so much. They could use, it is important to bring some heavier oil because the new American oil that's massive, it's the biggest oil producing country in the world now, the United States. So you know, why would they invade before Venezuela over this issue? But to mix some heavy oil, I should say, in with that light oil makes it more acceptable to the older refineries. So there is some need for heavier oil, but there was never an impetus to invade for what it would take to invade or change the regime in Venezuela to get that oil, regardless of what Chavez constantly said and Maduro constantly said. Now, I should say that there may be a change in this calculation now by the Trump administration. The reason they might calculate different is the United States, it's not just Trump, both parties agree on this, the war in Ukraine has to end. And it seems quite clear that the longer the war goes on, the more difficult it is for the Ukrainians to resist. Doesn't look like it's going to get better for them if the war goes on and on. So the problem is you have Putin making creeping advances on the battlefield, advances in his missile capacities, some advances in finance as compared to the Europeans who are having trouble financing the war. You need an equalizer. So what the United States, in my analysis, has done is around this summer, Trump agreed to turn to coercion against Putin. And aside from giving more weapons to the Ukrainians, the other thing is both Democrat and Republican senators in the United States very broadly say Russia is a petrostate. It's the petrostate's money, especially oil, somewhat gas, but especially oil, that allows it to make this aggressive war. It's this oil also income that also allows it to make trouble for all the former USSR countries around its borders, such as Bulgaria, Romania, and so forth as well. And it also to do mischief in Africa and actually to support the Venezuelan government. So the American administration, but not just that, the American Senate, overwhelmingly bipartisan, something like 90 senators, we think now, would vote for this law that would be what both parties, the leaders of both parties in the Senate, call draconian and bone-crushing sanctions on Russia. The idea is to really hit the Russian petrostate hard, to stop it from exporting. Now, there's a good situation in the market to do this because there's plenty of extra oil in the world right now. There's a big glut, one of the biggest gluts. There's oil on ships that don't have anywhere to go. So longer term, to replace the Russian oil and to prevent oil price spiking, you need oil probably from Venezuela as well as more oil from the United States and the Middle East. Guyana even, which is right next to Venezuela, has something like two massive ships, 3-4 million barrels, heading to India. It's going to take to January to get there. So it makes sense that if Venezuela is brought online, the Americans would say, more oil that allows us to remove Russian barrels from the market without spiking the price of oil and causing inflation. So for the first time in 25 or 26 years of the Chavistas in power, for the first time I think oil is a factor. It was never a factor before. But there is some issue of drugs and immigration that fits Trump's political perspective in the United States also.
So your thesis is that...
It's very long. I hope it's okay.
I understood it. So your thesis is that...
Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Your thesis is that as hitting the Russia petrostate, the United States can have an edge with Venezuela's crude oil.
Well, I think the reason that the United States wants to go after Russian exports is because they see this is the main finance for the trouble Russia causes in the world, especially the war in Ukraine. Okay, so the problem is if you're going to go after that and take it offline, you have to have replacements for it to keep the price reasonable. There's a lot of extra oil in the market, but if they brought Venezuela online, the biggest reserves in the world, now they're producing last month about 800,000 barrels, under 1 million barrels, okay? They used to produce something like 5 million barrels before the Chavistas came to power and Maduro. This is plenty, though, to keep the regime going, but not enough to feed the people. So it's a miserable situation, but the regime can, have a good life and pay for the military and so forth. So in any case, if there was a change of regime in Venezuela that's sympathetic to the United States, and there's not too much chaos afterwards, if things are calm, huge investments would go into the oil sector. The Americans have been in the oil sector before. ExxonMobil was there for years. Chevron is still there through all this. And there's many other foreign companies that have a lot of experience there. And I have no doubt they would go there. It would take some while to develop that oil because the infrastructure is old, rusty, hasn't been repaired. But there might be a market for it if Russia's exports are 3, 4, 5 million barrels are taken off the market. And I just want to say, if you don't mind, the reason, I think one reason, the impetus for Trump and the Americans to go after Russian oil is, as I said earlier, the Russians seem to have a creeping advantage on the battlefield in missiles and in finance, and you need to find an equalizer. Putin doesn't want to talk. He keeps giving the same maximalist demands. Why does he even come to the table? I think it's every time Trump escalates on weapons to Ukraine, but escalates. Putin sees the end game here could be that the Americans and their allies could destroy the Russian oil sector. So even if he's not ready, he's ready to talk and see. But as that goes on, so this is, I think, one of the equalizers, the few equalizers the West has.
And about Maduro, can he negotiate his exit or salvation with negotiating with Trump about the oil reserves?
Well, I think that if there's a negotiation, it probably won't include something about the oil reserves. I'll tell you why. The Trump administration, both the first administration and the present administration, there's a fellow called Richard Grenell. He was an ambassador in the first Trump administration to Germany, actually. And he was in charge of trying to make deals with Maduro over the past year, since January or February, when Trump came in. He went to Caracas together, we know, he went together on a plane with oil executives from Florida who want to invest, who already know the country well, and thought that this could help making a deal with Maduro. Now the problem is, there have been many, many deals with Maduro. Many presidents, including Trump, will let you produce more oil, will let Chevron, an American company, come and continue to produce oil, or will let whatever company, British Petroleum earlier, come and produce, or the Chinese produce more oil, will lift the sanctions, and in return you've agreed with the opposition to have an open election, democratic election, and accept the results. Time and time again it fell apart. Maduro never complied with his responsibilities under this agreement. So lately they were trying to make a deal, and they did the same thing. They let him export more oil. The deal that Trump said is, I don't want Maduro to gain money from this, but he owes so much money to foreign oil companies, he can export the oil and let him pay off the companies for a while. But anyway, so my understanding is Grenell tried these deals. I could tell you much more about these deals. But at a certain point, people in the Trump administration, the Secretary of State and the head of the National Security Council, Mr. Rubio, who was a senator for many years in the Foreign Relations Committee. He's of Cuban heritage. He speaks fluent Spanish. He's very interested in getting rid of Maduro. He said, no, we can't trust Maduro. And I believe the head of the opposition, the current head of the opposition, Maria Corina Machado, she would also say it just doesn't work. She's always been against negotiating with Maduro or Chavez, where others wanted to. So I think they both have convinced Trump, we can't trust this. Even if you make a deal with him, who's going to invest in oil a 25 or 30-year investment? When in 1 year, 1 month, but maybe 2, 3, 5 years, he'll do the same thing again, okay, to the foreign companies. So I think Trump is convinced it won't happen as long as he's there. Then we can talk about, okay, how do you get him to leave? And that's a very difficult question that has implications depending on how it happens.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what are the possible scenarios from now on? What do you expect to happen?
I would say, from the viewpoint, let me back up. Let me just say, first of all, there are many people who supported Chavez and later Maduro because they were against the long history of American interventions in Latin America or were susceptible to left populism. It's not only the right that wants Maduro gone, but much of the center and much of the left feel this man is an embarrassment, and he's causing crisis in all the other countries because of 8 million refugees, right? It's not just the United States. It's huge, crisis. So it's time for him to go. And people thought an election, negotiations, but again and again, he didn't follow that. He lost 80% of the vote in this last election. It's been documented by the opposition, by Maria Corina Machado and her organization.
Edmundo Gonzalez, yes.
Yes, that Gonzalez won the election, her ally Gonzalez. It doesn't make any difference. Maduro declared himself president. So now it's very broadly felt this man has to go. It's actually a human rights issue for the population, people starving and so forth. Okay. Now, put that aside, how do you get Maduro out? I would say the absolute best thing is through pressuring him. You make threats. He could be certainly, the Americans have put a bounty on his head as a criminal drug dealer. So he knows what he faces, if he could face. So you make a deal with him. If you leave, I'll give you some amnesty or something. I could imagine them trying to make such a deal if he was really threatened. The best thing would be if he made a deal and agreed to go. Therefore, his followers would not be likely to say, this is an American intervention, this is a coup, an imperialist coup or whatever, and they're just coming to steal our oil and fueling resistance, whether it's centralized or it's very broken up. Venezuela is a very much armed country with many armed groups dependent on the state. I could talk about that in some detail. And there's a lot of guerrillas who were formerly guerrillas in Colombia for decades. They're experienced. They mine gold illegally and get money from other things, from other drugs and also oil. So these people will be very hard to remove. So if you have a deal with Maduro at the top, okay, it's more likely that all these won't resist. If you don't have a deal and he's forced out, either, okay, the next best thing, if his own military makes a coup, probably not paid by the Americans or because they think it's in their best interest, whatever. Again, that might have some legitimacy. There's a history of this in Venezuela, the military taking over in the name of democracy and holding elections. That would be the next best. The worst is if he has to be physically removed and arrested by some American special operations. The Americans, I hope, have learned from their experience in Iraq, if something like that happens, you need to be willing to invest a large amount of forces to stabilize the country against riots, looting, terrorist gangs, and if you don't, it'll really be misery for the country in the future. So we don't know exactly what their plan is. It seems to be to do like they did to Iran recently, to have shock and awe sort of missiles, knock out. Compared to any other country the United States has ever invaded in the last 100 years in Latin America, Venezuela has the most capable military, air defenses. It's nothing like Iran or something, but it's relatively capable and could do a lot of damage. It could do a lot of damage to other countries' oil and refining sectors around it with sabotage also. So this has to be, if they're going to do that, they have to do it responsibly, if there is such a thing as overthrowing a government responsibly.
I read today a Bloomberg comment on the Bulgarian site of Bloomberg that said that there was a hope for an oil boom in Iraq after the invasion and after the fall of Saddam Hussein.
Julian Lee said that, yes.
Yes. And you touched upon that there may be an oil boom in Venezuela and American investment. Let's say a few words on that issue.
Everybody expects, the Venezuelan opposition expects, they have all their PowerPoint presentations, and some of it's fairly well thought out, how we will redevelop all these different oil fields. What companies will invite, will partially or completely, it depends on what the plan, privatize the big state oil company to make it more, well, first thing, to pay off a lot of the foreign debt. They have a huge foreign debt. But also maybe to bring more competence and to reduce the corruption inside the country. So there's these ideas. However, if it's completely peaceful, it's going to take some years because it just takes a long time to build infrastructure, and the ministries in Venezuela are totally incompetent, totally dysfunctional. Companies in Venezuela have been ravaged by this government. So you don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the supply chains, you don't have the skilled labor that you used to have when this is one of the biggest oil producers in the world. It's all gone. People will have to come back to Venezuela who have skills, who've gone to school outside and want to work. That's a huge organizational problem. So at best, in a peaceful country, you'll see the increase, but it'll be 5-10 years before probably you'd have a normally functioning country. If at the same time there's terrorism, there's sabotage, or there's actual areas of the country that the government can't control, which is quite likely given the presence of former guerrillas and illegal mining gangs and so forth. It'd be very different in jungles and mountainous areas. There'll be areas that aren't controllable. So that would take a lot longer, and then you're talking about a scenario like Iraq, to answer your question. In Iraq, the Americans didn't take seriously they didn't take seriously is they protected the oil infrastructure, they protected the oil ministry, but that's it. They didn't provide for the security of the country. And so it was, who cares if you control the oil field if there's no security outside the oil field?
Thank you for that comment, Thomas. It was so interesting. Thank you a lot. I hope in the future we can talk again about Ukraine, about Russia, because now it's a very major issue in Bulgaria also with our biggest refinery in Burgas.